I don't know. I just felt like I was quitting. I felt like I felt like a failure, and I felt like the devil was wanting. He was wanting our marriage to fail, so I didn't want him to win. I just felt like, if this was my life, I'd rather be dead than have to go through another day or experience another drunk with him. I have the courage to actually do something about it this time, because even once, it's unacceptable.
It started as an ordinary Sunday afternoon, a mother at the pool with her daughter. But within minutes, it would become one of the most shocking and public acts of domestic violence Miami had ever seen. A man enters quietly. He's not here to swim. He's here to kill. By the time witnesses react, the woman is already running, her child screaming nearby, bullets echoing through the air. And this wasn't the first time he'd taken a life. Today, we uncovered the chilling case of Shandell Harris, a rising community leader whose life was cut short by the man she thought she could trust. A man tied to a trail of other suspicious deaths. This is the story of charm turned to control, love turned to fear, and warning signs ignored until it was too late. Stick around, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning how many other predators are hiding in plain sight. On a warm Sunday afternoon, April 3rd, 2022, the sound of children learning to swim echoed across the Michael Ann Russell Jewish Community Center in North Miami Beach. Parents watched from the pool deck, towels draped over chairs, phones out for quick photos, the small joys of a family weekend unfolding without urgency. Among them was 30-year-old Shandell Harris, daughter, mother, college grad, community voice. With her 12-year-old daughter and her own mother beside her, they had come for a routine swim lesson. Nothing about that day was supposed to be remarkable, until a man walked through the gate and changed everything. Witnesses would later say the man looked like he knew exactly where he was going. He crossed the deck with purpose. People remember him arguing, raising his voice, a gun appearing, then shots, sharp, echoing off the water, screams, a mother running, a man chasing, more shots, and then the silence that follows the unthinkable. Within minutes, private security had the suspect at gunpoint. Police arrived, took him into custody, and began the grim, careful process of preserving a crime scene where families had stood moments earlier. The man under arrest was 45-year-old Carl Monty Watts Jr. He was the victim's husband. He would be charged with second-degree murder. The name of the woman, Shandell Harris, spread quickly through the local news. A young Miami woman, a mother, shot multiple times in front of her child. And as detectives began to pull the thread, the day's horror unraveled into something larger. This was not the first time there had been violence, not even that weekend, and possibly not the first time a woman close to this man had vanished or died. In the pool area, witnesses described a confrontation. According to police summaries reported by local outlets, Carl arrived with a gun and approached Shandell. He tried to pressure her, offering money if she would drop fresh charges she had filed the day before and remain in the marriage. She refused. She told him no. Moments later, he opened fire. When she ran, he chased her and continued shooting until he had emptied the weapon. Officers and reporters would later say that the pool deck, the most ordinary of weekend settings, became the scene of a domestic violence homicide carried out in public, in broad daylight, with a child looking on. The child's swim lesson had just begun. To understand why Shandell said no that Sunday, you have to step back to Saturday, April 2nd, 2022. According to police, Carl and Shandell argued at their Miami apartment. The argument turned violent. She was stabbed, reportedly multiple times. She survived, fled to safety, and reported the assault to Miami police. By the time officers tried to locate Carl, he was gone. The next day, he found her at the pool. It is the pattern advocates warn about. The danger spike when a survivor leaves, files, or sets boundaries. That weekend, Shandell tried to take her life back, and the very next day, she was killed. Security at the JCC detained Carl on site. Miami-Dade officers placed him under arrest and transported him for questioning. By the end of the day, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office announced that he was charged with second-degree murder and possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, with additional counts later noted in local coverage. In initial appearances, he showed little emotion. A judge ordered him held without bond. He later pled not guilty and requested a jury trial. For Shandell's family, still in shock, that first court date was only the beginning of a longer fight. Friends and relatives describe Shandell as a builder of people, of community, of moments. She grew up in Miami, graduated from Miami Northwestern Senior High, then attended Florida International University, earning her degree with honors. She volunteered in schools, churches, and shelters. She hoped to enter public service in Miami-Dade government one day. Her daughter watched her study, work, and show up for people. That was the model at home. Those who knew her say she was relentless in support of others, and that she loved being a mom most of all. As reporters combed records in the days after the arrest, another story began to surface. Carl Watts had a long criminal history, with arrests for robbery, batteries, drug offenses, domestic violence, and probation violations spanning years. This, unfortunately, is not uncommon in intimate partner homicide. A trail of prior violence, some charged, some not, often across jurisdictions. But the part that froze people mid-scroll was this. Police publicly linked Watts as a person of interest in the disappearance of a former partner, and local agencies said they were re-examining the 2009 homicide of another woman he dated. Neither case had resulted in charges against him, yet the pattern in headlines was hard to ignore. Trukita Scott was 24, a mother of two, when she vanished on June 25, 2014. She left work in Fort Lauderdale and never picked up her toddlers from daycare. Her Nissan Altima turned up abandoned in Liberty City. Fort Lauderdale police later confirmed that Carl Watts was a person of interest. He was questioned. He was never charged. Her family still wants answers. 8 years later, after Shandell's murder, Fort Lauderdale police reiterated that interest publicly, again urging anyone with information to come forward. The passage of time did not dim suspicion or hope. Vicki Simmons was 25 when she was found dead at a Biscayne Boulevard motel in 2009. Her killing has remained unsolved. In April 2022, after Carl's arrest in Shandell's case, Miami-Dade police said they were taking another look at Simmons' death, and family members told reporters they had long suspected Watts. He was never charged in that case. Carl Watts has not been charged in connection with Trukita Scott's disappearance or Vicki Simmons' murder. The renewed attention came because of Shandell's killing and the relationships binding these three women to the same man. In the days after the shooting, Shandell's mother spoke to local reporters, her voice steady but shattered. She had watched the attack unfold. She had seen her daughter run. She had seen him chase. She used the word hunted, and then she used another word, sacrifice. If her daughter's death forced the system to act faster next time, she said, maybe some other child would still have a mother. Community leaders called the shooting what it was, a fatal domestic violence incident and a system failure. The weekend before, there had been a stabbing reported to police. By Sunday, Shandell was dead. Advocates asked the hard questions. Were the right alerts in place? Was he being sought with urgency? What protections were available in that 24-hour window? Why was a man with a serious criminal history so close, so quickly, with a weapon he should not have possessed? There aren't easy answers, but there are patterns, one survivors know too well. In Miami-Dade Bond Court, a judge reviewed the probable cause narrative and denied bond. The state charged Carl with second-degree murder with a deadly weapon in possession of a firearm by a convicted felon. Local reports also referenced related counts tied to the prior day's assault and evidence issues. Weeks later, he pled not guilty. As of open reporting in 2022, the case was proceeding toward trial. Her name is Shandell Harris. She loved her daughter. She believed in community. She believed in doing the work. On a Sunday afternoon, she showed up to a swim lesson and trusted that the public world would be safe enough to breathe in. It wasn't. What we remember now is not just the horror of that day, but the constellation of failures and warnings that preceded it. The Saturday call, the years of criminal history, the two cases that still ache with unanswered questions. We will return to those questions. Because this story is not only about what happened at a pool, it is about how we got there. On Saturday, April 2nd, 2022, Shandell Harris tried to reclaim her life. During a confrontation at their Miami apartment, Carl Watts allegedly stabbed her multiple times. She escaped and called the police. His charge? Possibly domestic battery with a weapon. A terrifying escalation, but not uncommon in patterns of intimate partner violence. Hours later, her mother and daughter were still alive. By the next day, they would all be shattered. By Sunday, law enforcement had a domestic violence call report, yet the protection system failed them. Carl found Shandell at the swimming center. Witnesses recounted the final words, the gunshots, the chase, the collapse. One bystander said, "He chased her, shot her like an animal, like he was hunting." When she fell, he fired again, over and over, until his magazine clicked empty. Security subdued Carl on the spot. Police arrived minutes later, arrested him, and retrieved the murder weapon. In bond court, he was charged with second-degree murder with a weapon and firearm possession by a felon. There were murmurs in the room. Why wasn't it elevated to first degree? The judge noted Carl had gone to the center with a gun and fired repeatedly. Nearly 3 weeks later, Carl entered a plea, not guilty. He wrapped himself in silence. Miami-Dade Public Defender's Office stood firm in court, requesting a jury trial, setting the stage for lengthy legal proceedings. Investigators quickly dug into Carl's record, a trail beginning in the 1990s, spanning robbery, fraud, drug charges, even an escape from prison in the mid-2000s. Over 2 decades of brushes with the law, yet he remained uncaged until that fatal day. Once news of Shandell's death hit headlines, 2 older cases were dusted off. 2014 disappearance of Trukita Scott. His ex, her toddlers alone, never seen again. Carl was long known to police, but never charged. 2009 murder of Vicki Simmons, another ex, found dead under suspicious circumstances. Families of both women now share a haunted wait for answers. These developments turned a domestic tragedy into a chilling investigation into possibly serial patterns. Shandell wasn't just a name on news scrolls. She was someone's daughter, mother, sister, friend. Loved ones gathered at her funeral, at vigils, at rallies, calling for justice and reforms. Advocates warned, every domestic violence case is already a warning sign. In this case, the alarms were flashing. Local voices echoed with grief and outrage at missed opportunities when intervention could have saved her. As the story rippled through Miami and later national news, prosecutors prepotentively began building a case, not just on the poolside shooting, but on a pattern. Motions were filed, discovery opened, detailing prioritizing testimony, timelines, forensic ballistic mapping, prior threats. These would all be weaponized in court. This wasn't one tragedy. It was a system stacked against Shandell and maybe others. April 26, 2022, 3 weeks after the poolside execution, Carl Monty Watts Jr. entered a plea, not guilty, represented by the Public Defender's Office. Court watchers noted his absence in an early hearing. Her family, especially Shandell's brother Tyrell and father Matthew Everett, sat clutching documents, demanding accountability. Prosecutors continued stacking charges: second-degree murder with a weapon, unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon, and beyond. Judge Glazer publicly raised an eyebrow at the second-degree designation. He brought a gun to the JCC. It should be first degree. For families and advocates, this legal process would be agonizingly slow. For them, each hearing was a heartbeat, an echo of their grief unfolding in court. Advocates note in statistically grim terms that when a partner uses a weapon, like a gun in domestic violence, the homicide risk skyrockets. An expert told CBS Miami that's up by 500%. Watts had stepped forcefully across that threshold. That Saturday's stabbing wasn't an isolated flare. It was the combustible fuel. Shandell escaping, filing charges, and Watts unchecked, following through. Hours after his arrest, police reevaluated two cases that had long haunted families, both involving women once close to Watts. Trikita Scott, 24, disappeared in June 2014. Her car was found in Liberty City. She vanished after leaving work. Watts, her ex, was long considered a person of interest. Now police reopened that investigation. Vicki Simmons, 25, found murdered in a North Miami hotel in 2009. Watts had been questioned but never charged. After Shandell's death, investigators began looking again. For Trukita's family, the reopening was bittersweet. The grief was fresh again, 8 years later. They asked, what else needs to happen for action? While families waited for justice, Miami-Dade leaders and advocates raised urgent questions. How could a man with a long criminal record, including weapons offenses, slip through gaps until murder became inevitable? Looking at 662 domestic violence calls already logged that year, they met to analyze these failures and advocate for stronger prevention. Characterizing Watts requires delicacy, but the public record suggests a repeat typology: violence, control, and victims within his orbit. From the stabbing on Saturday to the execution on Sunday, his actions were consistent with escalating coercive behavior. The reopened cold cases deepened concerns that his lethal capacity operated long before Shandell's death. When mapped, Watts's history tells a troubling story. 90s to 2000s, early arrests for robbery, drug trafficking, and domestic battery. 2009, Vicki Simmons killed, case unsolved. 2014, disappearance of Trukita Scott, case unsolved. 2022, stabbing of Shandell, followed by her murder within 24 hours. In each case, warning signs were visible. Police reports, restraining orders, and prior charges painted a profile of an offender, escalating over time. Yet without strong enough evidence or systemic coordination, the pattern continued unchecked. For Shandell's mother, Delina Everett, the grief is layered. She is not just mourning her daughter. She is carrying the weight of knowing other women's families have lived this nightmare too. At candlelight vigils, she speaks to crowds about the cost of inaction in domestic violence cases. These women should be here today. My daughter should be here. We can't just light candles. We need to change the system that lets men like him keep hurting people. By mid-2022, the state's case against Carl Monty Watts Jr. was already shaping up to be one of the most closely watched trials in Miami-Dade history. The prosecution's stance was clear. This was not a crime of passion. It was premeditated murder committed by a man with a long history of violence toward women. To prove it, they had the surveillance footage from the Michael Ann Russell Jewish Community Center, eyewitness testimony, including that of Shandell's own mother, and ballistics evidence tying the shell casings directly to the gun Watts carried that day. On a warm Monday morning, the courtroom was silent as the lead prosecutor, Assistant State Attorney Maria Velasquez, stepped forward. Her opening words were deliberate, every syllable designed to sear into the jury's memory. This is not a case of a man who lost control. This is a case of a man who controlled every detail until the moment his victim dared to take back her life. Velasquez laid out the timeline. The stabbing on April 2nd, Shandell's escape to her mother's home, her refusal to reconcile, and Watts' calculated decision to track her to the community center the very next day. She promised jurors they would see video evidence, hear from eyewitnesses, and learn about a history of violence spanning decades. Her voice tightened when she spoke of Shandell's 12-year-old daughter, how she witnessed every shot, every desperate step her mother took to escape. She will never unsee what he did, and neither should you. As the trial began, the prosecution's first witness was David Lomas, the lifeguard on duty that afternoon. Under questioning, David described the moment Watts entered the pool area, wearing a dark hoodie despite the heat. Scanning the pool deck, eyes locking instantly on Shandell. Ignoring posted signs forbidding firearms on the premises, David recalled seeing Watts approach Shandell, speaking briefly before pulling a gun from his waistband. The first shot rang out before David could even get off his chair. She tried to run. He followed her, like he was hunting. There was no hesitation. When asked how many shots he heard, David's voice faltered. "Too many. I stopped counting." Next came the most emotionally devastating testimony, the words of Delina Everett, Shandell's mother. Her voice trembled as she relived the events of that day. "I was sitting right there. I saw him point the gun. I screamed for my baby to run. She tried. She really tried." Delina described the terror of seeing her daughter fall, the panic of pulling her granddaughter behind cover, and the surreal moment when private security detained Watts at gunpoint. When the prosecutor asked what Shandell had told her in the days before the shooting, Delina's tears fell freely. She said, "Mama, I'm done. He's not going to change. I just want peace." Several jurors visibly shifted in their seats during Delina's testimony. Some avoided her gaze. Others leaned forward, taking in every word. The weight of her grief was impossible to ignore. By the end of the first week, the prosecution had painted a picture not of a momentary lapse, but of a man whose violence was deliberate, repeated, and escalating. The jurors leaned in as the prosecution began introducing cold case files, photographs, and testimony from detectives who had worked those earlier cases. The trial was no longer just about the death of Shandell Harris. It had become a chilling examination of a man whose life seemed to leave a trail of women gone or dead. And with that, the weight of Watts' past began to bear down on the jury, like a shadow that could no longer be ignored. The first ghost the prosecution summoned was Trita Scott, 24 years old, a devoted mother, and, like Shandell, linked to Watts through a romantic relationship. She vanished in 2014, her car found abandoned in Fort Lauderdale. Inside were her purse and phone. Outside, there were no signs of a struggle. Detective Angela Moreno took the stand, explaining how Watts was the last known person to see her alive. "We know they met the morning she disappeared. We know there was an argument. And we know that hours later, her car was parked in an industrial area she had no reason to visit." The similarities were chilling. Both women had recently ended their relationships with Watts. Both had confided in friends about fearing for their lives, and both had been actively avoiding him. Although no body was ever found in Trita's case, the prosecution implied that the pattern was too precise to be coincidence. Then came Vicki Simmons. She was 25, vibrant, and full of plans to leave Miami for a fresh start. In 2009, she was found dead in a North Miami hotel room. The cause? Blunt force trauma to the head. The killer was never identified. Detective Moreno testified that in the weeks before her death, Vicki had told her sister she was ending her relationship with Watts. She said he wouldn't let her go. She was scared, said she felt like she was being followed. Jurors exchanged glances. Even without convictions, the accumulation of these stories painted a portrait far darker than anything the defense had suggested. These women weren't faceless victims in a file. They were people with voices, dreams, and fears. Prosecutor Velasquez drove the point home. This isn't about one bad day. This is about a man who views women as property, and when they try to leave, he eliminates them. It was a sentence that seemed to hang in the air long after she said it. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about mystery, it's about choice. The defendant made choices repeatedly, to harm, to intimidate, and finally is to kill. Her voice tightened as she walked toward the jury rail. Shandell Harris was a mother. She was a daughter. She was trying to build a life. And when she chose freedom, he chose to take it from her forever. The courtroom was silent, so silent that the faint ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening. The judge looked over her glasses, scanning the jurors before addressing the foreperson. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? We have, Your Honor. In the case of the state of Florida versus Carl Monty Watts Jr., on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged. The morning after the verdict, the courtroom filled once again. Now they would determine Carl Monty Watts Jr.'s punishment. The prosecution began with impact statements, raw, unfiltered accounts from those who had lived through the nightmare. Shandell's mother stepped forward, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. I watched my daughter take her last breath. I heard her cry out for help, and I couldn't save her. Her words cut through the room, breaking the composure of even the most stoic faces. She described how Shandell had been full of life, determined to create a better world, and how that life was stolen in the most violent way possible. After hours of deliberation, the jurors returned. On the matter of sentencing, they recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was unanimous. The judge looked directly at Watts. You have shown no remorse for your actions. The court has no doubt that if given the chance, you would harm again. This sentence ensures that you will never again walk free. With the gavel's final strike, Carl Watts' fate was sealed. For Shandell's family, the sentence brought closure, but not healing. Her daughter, who had witnessed the horror that day, now grows up without her mother. Her mother still visits her grave, leaving flowers and speaking to her as if she were still here. Advocates for domestic violence victims point to Shandell's case as a grim reminder of the danger when red flags are ignored. Carl Monty Watts will live out the rest of his days behind prison walls, but the scars he left on those who loved Shandell Harris will never fade. Her life's mission, to protect and uplift others, now lives on through the voices of those who tell her story. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, please seek help. No one should wait until it's too late.